Can you think of some things that you wish you would have thought a little bit harder about, that you had thought twice about before you said them? Maybe some of those things that you say to people, oh, it's no trouble at all, right? No, don't worry about it. I love cats. We have plenty of room. Call me anytime, really, anytime. I'll try anything once. Of course, bring the kids. If worst comes to worst, you can use mine. Or over my dead body, you will. How often we say things that we don't really mean, and how often we speak about somebody only to find out maybe they understood or heard what we said about them. How often we make promises that we don't keep. Solomon said these wise words in the book of Proverbs: the one who guards his mouth preserves his life, and the one who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. Proverbs 13 and verse 3. There are so many problems, major problems that could be avoided or that are caused by our words. Sometimes words even have a drastic impact on life and death. That's what Solomon said. The one who guards his mouth preserves his life. Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 speaks of followers of Jesus needing to be salt of the earth and light of the world. And we can't be those things if our speech does not reflect our commitment to Jesus. And so we need to do a better job. Simply this morning, all we're saying is doing a better job of thinking before we speak. We need to think before opening. That is, think before opening our mouths. And so in order to guard our words, what are some things that we need to do? Well, we're going to follow along in Matthew chapter 5 in this simple section with just a few verses, but maybe a section not often talked about. Matthew chapter 5, 33 through 37. And the first thing we see from Jesus, to guard our words, we must think before assuming. He starts out in this section, it's the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, but he picks up here in verse 33 saying, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil." So Jesus talks about a plurality of topics in Matthew chapter 5, anger, lust, marriage and divorce, and those things that he's already spoken on. Very similarly, he touches on this topic in the same way, in the sense that there's a difference between what the people had heard or what they'd been taught by their religious leaders and what Jesus has come to teach. There's a difference between what they heard and what I say, Jesus says. And so when you find verse 33, that's what he's talking about. You have heard that it was said, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. What we find here is not actually a direct quote from the Old Testament, but actually a combination of several Old Testament teachings. For instance, Deuteronomy 23 and verse 21 reads, "When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it would be sinful in you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you." So that passage is about not delaying, not putting off a vow that you've said that you would do. Also, compared to the third of the 10 commandments, the instructions of fulfilling a vow are closely related. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. That's Exodus 20 and verse 7, the third commandment. And then maybe one more worthy of mentioning, Numbers 30 and verse 2 actually uses both the words vow and oath. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his words. He shall do according to all that proceed out of his mouth. So maybe one thing that holds us up in this context is, what is the meaning of a vow? What is the meaning of an oath, and what are the difference? Well, generally we would think of a vow as an earnest promise that binds one to a specified act. In that case, a vow not necessarily linking anything to God, but an oath calls on God as a witness that what someone says is true. That's generally the distinction between the two. However, in Jesus' teaching, the distinction really is not clear, and it really doesn't matter all that much. Those terms can be used interchangeably, a vow and an oath. At the end of the day, what he's saying makes sense. D.A. Carson, though, concludes to say the Mosaic law forbade irreverent oaths, light use of the Lord's name, and broken vows. So what Jesus is sort of summarizing the entire Old Testament in this one phrase in the way that people use their words. Don't use the name of God's name in a light or vain way. Don't give oaths that you don't plan to keep, and don't break the vows that you make. So these are the things that the Jews had heard based on Old Testament texts, but that their religious leaders of the day had sort of twisted and added to, just like all the other teachings that had been done. What Jesus is coming to do, though, is to smash all of those assumptions, to get rid of the presuppositions, and he wants to say, yeah, that's what you've heard. That's what you think God expects from you, but I'm going to present to you a new way. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So the first thing we want to consider is, before even what he says about how we speak, is about how we approach God's word. We need Jesus challenging us to think before we presume, to think before we assume things about God's word. Do we think we already know what is best? Do we think the way we're living is the best way of living? Well, of course we do, because that's why we're doing it. But are we doing it because everyone else around us is doing it? Or are we doing it as because that's what God says to do? And is it possible? Is it possible in your life right now, in our lives right now, that Jesus could actually present a better way? Is it possible that Jesus is offering something better that's going to lead us to a better lifestyle, but also to blessings and to a better end result? And are we willing to listen? Are we willing to consider Jesus' way? That's really what all of this is about, listening to Jesus' way. And so Jesus says, in order to guard our words, first of all, we must think before making these kinds of assumptions, especially as the Jews did in their day. But secondly, let's notice, think before using God's name. If we're going to really guard our mouths, if we're going to really preserve our lives, Proverbs 13 and verse 3, we need to think before we use God's name. Let's read it again. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So David Roper helps us understand what's going on for Jesus to say what he said here. Now, apparently, the Jewish teachers of the day had a pretty elaborate system of trying to figure out which promises you make you had to keep and which you didn't. They had this system to figure out which vows were binding and which were not. So Jesus is actually sort of touching on a subject that later he's going to get into in more detail. Remember Matthew chapter 23 and the scathing rebuke of the scribes and the Pharisees. He deals more with that there. But it shows up here in Matthew chapter 5. And what they had done, they made this distinction but between whether or not God's name was involved, and that links to whether or not you had to do what you said you'd do. And it sounds kind of ridiculous, but Jewish rabbis taught that a vow was binding only if you use God's name. So as a result, what happens? Well, people that don't want to keep their vows will get as close to God's name as possible. They'll include things like heaven. They'll swear by heaven, or they'll swear by the earth, or by the city of Jerusalem. They'll even swear by their own heads, meaning their own lives. I swear by my own life, I'll do this, right? They've come up with all these things that they could say and that they could do. And in those cases, they wouldn't consider themselves obligated to keep that vow. Now, if you're like me, you're thinking that sounds pretty ridiculous. Why vow at all? Why make the effort to try to come up with this phrase? It kind of sounds like children arguing, right? Well, you said you'd do it. Yeah, but I had my fingers crossed, right? Well, I didn't see your fingers crossed. Oh, no, they were behind my back. You just didn't see it. I mean, it sounds kind of ridiculous to me. And we may think, well, surely these kinds of things are not happening today. Are we sure about that, though? You know, to a lot of people, there are different rules about truth. There are different rules about whether you are serious about what you say and maybe you don't plan on doing what you say. There are different rules about telling the truth depending on whatever situation that you're in. Well, you know, mostly I'm truthful, but, well, there's situations in business where maybe it's okay to lie, or politics, for sure, you've got to lie sometimes, or maybe it's okay to lie to my spouse every now and then. Jesus is clearing up all of this for us as well as for the Jews, that none of the things that they swore by could be separated from God. The reality is they try to come up with a system to try to get away with their vows, get as close to saying God's name without actually saying God's name. But Jesus says it doesn't matter because you're still saying God's name. You're still associating these things with God. Heaven is his throne. How could you swear by heaven and think you're not swearing by God? The earth is his creation and his footstool. You're still swearing by God when you swear by the earth. And Jerusalem is where the temple of God is located. That's where God resides in the Old Testament concept of things. That's where God is located. Even your own head was created by God, and every hair bears the stamp of his handiwork. And so whatever you swear by, Jesus is saying, you're still swearing by God. You can't even change the natural color of your hair. And so what he's really saying is that nothing in life can be separated from the Creator of all things. No matter how you swear or how you vow or how you promise, you're still a creation of God, and it's still linked. And that vow is heard even before God himself. See, Jesus is really at the base of things, teaching us a valuable lesson about how we view God. That's really what this is all about. And isn't it true that how we view God is going to be reflected in how we speak and in how we use his name in particular? A parent might say to their child, by God, or by all that is holy, don't you? Or if someone is annoyed at somebody else, they might say, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Or maybe somebody's really stressed out and they're worried and they say, God only knows how I'm going to get through this. Or maybe a mouse runs by and somebody might proclaim, Jesus Christ. Oh my God is used so commonly that most people don't realize how disrespectful it really is. And to add to that, the slightly altered versions of holy names like gosh and geez, those are no better. See, at the core of what Jesus is talking about is there's no thought behind the use of God's name. Albert Barnes wrote that there is no offense more awful than that committed by the profane swearer. And I know that could be debated, but he goes on to say, there is not in the universe more cause of amazement also at God's forbearance than that God does not rise in vengeance and smite the profane swearer at once to hell. Verily, in a world like this, where his name is profaned every day and hour and moment by the thousands, God shows that he is slow to anger and that his mercy is without bounds. Albert Barnes makes a good point about God's mercy, but also about how we think so little about how we use our words, and in particular, how we use God's name. Now, that is not to say there are not times when we would use phrases like, oh my God, and Jesus Christ in, of course, the correct way, such as singing a spiritual song that has those words in it. The problem that Jesus is addressing is that that most of the holy terms that people use in the Jewish day and as well as our day is they've just become too commonplace. They become complacent with the way that they use terms that are so sacred and so holy, referring to our God and to His Son. And so those phrases are generally spoken with little or no thought for God whatsoever. So that's the problem. We need to learn to use God's name more carefully. So to guard our words, what Jesus has been talking about is, first of all, just he says, here's what you've heard. Here's what you think is right, but here's what I want to present to you as right. Think before assuming. Think before assuming that you're saying and acting the way that you should. And he also says, think before using God's name. Make sure you put some thought to it whenever you use special terms that are associated with God and His kingdom. But here's another thought, and our final thought. To guard our words, we must think before making a promise. And that's really the surface level of this teaching as well. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, verse 34, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is His footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Here's what Jesus says. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. So the Jews had a system of figuring out which promises they had to keep and which they didn't, which vows they had to keep and which they didn't. But instead of trying to filter through all that, Jesus says, listen, don't try to figure out what you can say and get away with it. Don't try to figure out if, well, that person said that phrase, so they have to keep it. Quit messing with all of that and just don't make any oaths at all. If you say yes, then that's what you mean. And that's what you're going to do. If you say no, then guess what? That's what you mean. That's what you said. So that's what you need to follow through with. It should be unnecessary to reinforce your words with any kind of oath or any kind of vow or any kind of promise whatsoever. Now, James makes a similar statement in his epistle, James 5 and verse 12. But above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath. But your yes is to be yes, and your no is to be no, so that you may not fall under judgment. So even James connects the dots that Jesus does, is that anything outside of following what you said you would do, guess what? You fall under judgment for that. Guess what? It comes from the evil one. It is sin, in other words. We've got to avoid making careless promises. And these kinds of careless promises, frivolous oaths, not only are they wrong, Jesus says they come from the evil one, but they're also pointless, right? They're also useless. Think about this phrase. Someone has said, an honest man is believed without an oath, but a dishonest man is not believed though he use 1,000, right? Doesn't that make sense? I mean, if you can't believe someone unless they promise, then can you really believe them even if they do promise? Jesus is speaking to the core of who a Christian is supposed to be. Brothers and sisters, who you are and who we are supposed to be at the core of our foundation of our lives, just be a truthful person. That's really what Jesus is saying. Just be a truthful person. A Christian ought to strive for that. It's not easy. But a Christian ought to strive just to be truthful, to be honest at all times, more than anybody. You and I, we ought to be the people, the kind of people that don't need to promise. There was this young boy who was explaining to his baby brother how to interpret his parents' words. It gets kind of confusing, so he needed to explain. He said, listen, baby brother, if they say yes, that means maybe. Okay, and if they say, I'll think about it, that means no. Just forget it. And if they say no, well, all that means is you have to pester them twice as long to get what you want. Well, no, see, the place that we ought to learn truthfulness is in the home. That situation ought to not be. We ought to learn by teaching and by example of our parents, and along with appropriate punishment when we don't tell the truth. Our parents need to set the example for us, and we as parents and grandparents. So Jesus is just teaching, say what you mean and mean what you say. It says in Ephesians 4:25, laying aside falsehood, speak truth to each of you, his brother. Be a truthful person. Just be a truthful person. And again, that's not always easy. It was not too long ago we had a garage sale, and we were selling this ridiculous large china cabinet. And we didn't need it. We didn't have room for it. And it sat in our garage all day. And I tell you, you know how it feels. You get worried that it's not going to disappear like you want it to. Well, somebody had commented finally at the end of the day. We were so grateful. They commented on Facebook. They saw a picture of it. They'd take it for $20. We were so glad that they were going to come get it, and we agreed, of course. I tell you what, not 5 minutes later, true story, a man walks into the garage, and he loved that thing so much, he kept walking his offer. He offered $150 for that thing, and that hurt, but we'd already agreed to sell it to another person, so we had to say no. It's not easy. It's not easy to be a person of your word. In Psalm 15, David asked this question, O Lord, who will sojourn in your tent? Who will dwell on your holy hill? And otherwise, who's going to be a holy person? Who's going to be a godly person? And among the answers he gives is he who swears to his own hurt and does not change. See, that's at the core of being a truthful person. Sometimes telling the truth hurts. He who swears to his own hurt and does not change. If you tell your kids that you're going to get them ice cream tomorrow, then that's what you do. If you tell your boss that you're going to finish a project by Friday, don't give excuses. Do everything you can to make that promise a reality. When you vow in sickness and in health, forsaking all others as long as we both shall live, sometimes we forget. Sometimes we forget that that's a promise. And if that's what you said you would do, then that's what you do. Not just until your spouse no longer makes you happy. Not just until things aren't going as well as they were when I made that promise. No, just do what you said that you would do. Keep your word, even if it's difficult. Do what you said you would do, even if it hurts you. Even if it costs you something. Be a person of your word. The one who guards his mouth preserves his life. How wise of Solomon to say that. Proverbs 13 and verse 3. In order to do that, what Jesus has taught us this morning is that we've got to think before assuming. That maybe the way we're living is not exactly the way Jesus expects us to live, and we could learn something from his teaching. We also need to think before using God's name. God's holy and reverent name needs to be used only with great thought and great care. And we need to think before making a promise. In other words, we just need to think before opening our mouths. We've got a lot of problems in our society, a lot of struggles, a lot of issues, but many have rightly agreed that maybe of all the things we have is an integrity crisis in our culture. There are just very few people today who are willing to be honest. People just have such a hard time being truthful. But listen, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we see when we look at the world. Children of God should be, absolutely must be. We have to be the leaders in reversing that trend. Whatever problems there are, if there's an integrity crisis in our world, then guess what? We're the ones that have to change that. We are the leaders in reversing that trend. We have to be the salt of the earth. We have to be the light to the world. We are to do what we say. If others can't believe what we say when we talk about just everyday things, how could they believe what we say when it comes to the most important things? When it comes to eternal things? We have to be people of integrity. Jesus teaches something so basic but something so left out a lot in our daily lives. Does your yes mean yes? Or does it sometimes just mean maybe? Does your no mean no? Are you the kind of person that keeps your word? Do you ever find yourself making promises that you really didn't think much about, or that you really don't plan to keep? What about the way that you use God's name? Do you profane God's name in your speech? Do you ever fail to tell the truth? Listen, if any of these things are your struggle, if these are your struggle, listen, this morning, Jesus' appeal to you is to change. And that's really his appeal through Scripture, is that you would just change. That you would change your mind, that you would change your heart, that you would change your behavior, and in this case, that you would change your words. And Jesus doesn't leave us without help. You can do this change. You can make this change. You can do so with God's help. You can make a total 180-degree change of attitude and action. In fact, all of us are guilty to one degree or another this morning of what we've been talking about, of what Jesus teaches. And in fact, I would say that every single one of us probably needs to come forward, probably needs to respond to this lesson in a public way. All of us will respond in one way or another. It may just be ignoring what Jesus teaches, but we need to respond and we need to change. Let us all repent of our shortcomings. Let us really consider our heart, our words, and make some serious changes. Ask God to help us today to do better. And may God help us to think before opening our mouths. Listen, maybe for you today, maybe you need to apologize to your kids or your grandkids for not keeping your promises. Maybe you need to apologize to your spouse for not keeping the vow that you said you would do, and you need to recommit to your spouse this morning. Let me also remind you of another vow most everyone in this room has made. When you said that you believed that Jesus was the Son of God with your mouth before men, and you confessed that Jesus is your Lord, what you did that day, although that may have been years and years ago, you made a lifelong vow. You made a promise. Maybe today is the day that you need to renew that promise. You need to renew your commitment that you made to Jesus, your confession, to trust Him, to serve Him, to honor Him, to pattern your life after Him. Maybe you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters this morning. Whatever it is that you need, fully consider, think about the changes you need to make. Let us know how we can help. Would you come while we stand, while we sing?